At this point, I would like to welcome up William Sandy Darity, who is Director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity and Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics at Duke University. So Professor Darity will be introducing our panel for this evening. So welcome to Professor Darity.
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you, Adam, for the introduction and also for your directorship of the Global Inequality Research Initiative Seminar, which is a seminar series where we change the topic every semester. And so, for example, in spring 2021, the topic was athletes and activism. In fall 2021, because it was the anniversary year of a major American atrocity, the topic was the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre from a global perspective. And then in the previous semester, spring 2022, the topic was music, migration, and social revolution. And now in our most recent semester, the focus has been on the current health crisis in the United States and throughout the globe. The subject has been the pandemic, and it was linked to a book that has been produced by scholars at the Cook Center known as The Pandemic Divide: How COVID Increased Inequality in America, which was just released by the Duke University Press. And so it's a companion in terms of release time to the book that we're going to be focused on this evening. I think that both of these books are really reflective of the kind of commitment that scholars at the Cook Center have to addressing the primary and central issues of the day. So this is a capstone event for the Pandemic Divide segment of the Global Inequality Research Initiative, and it features two scholars, one of whom is a strong collaborator of mine, and the other is somebody I'm very, very privileged to finally have met in person. And so I'm going to start by introducing him, Jason Houle, who is a sociologist. He's an associate professor of sociology at Dartmouth College. He has a PhD in sociology and demography from Penn State University. And interestingly enough, well, maybe this isn't really that unusual, but to me it seemed to be unusual. You were an undergraduate at the University of Maine. And I believe you're the first academic I've ever met who was an undergraduate at the University of Maine. So on to Orinoco. Okay. Jason also was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Fellow, and his areas of interest are primarily social stratification and health disparities. He's even produced a paper on the labor market effects of incarceration for young adults. But I think that his primary focus is on issues of stratification and health inequalities, especially mental health disparities. Fenaba Addo is a public policy scholar and demographer whose PhD is from Cornell University in public policy. She is currently on the faculty at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she is a specialist on issues concerning racial inequality, household financial well-being, and public policies that are intended or designed to mitigate these types of inequalities. The point of convergence for Jason and for Fenaba that has resulted in their collaboration on a number of articles, as well as in the book that we're going to be featuring and discussing this evening, is the problem of student debt. And I would argue that they are the experts on this politically charged issue. They explore it comprehensively in their new book, Dream Defaulted. And I think in the course of their conversation, we probably will have an opportunity to hear something about the relationship between the pandemic and student debt. Well, we'll see how that evolves. And finally, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this conversation, Jillian Berman, who is a distinguished journalist, and she is the Deputy Enterprise Editor for MarketWatch. And I think she's the ideal moderator for this panel because for upwards of 3 to 4 years, her area of specialization has been student debt. And so, so we're really thrilled that you're here this evening to moderate this panel. I would add that she was a 2019 to 2020 Knight Bagehot Fellow in Economics and Business Journalism at Columbia, and Columbia is the university where she received her MBA from the business school. So I'd like to have Jason, Fenaba, and Jillian come to the stage. Thank you. This way.
For having me to talk about this very exciting and important book. I'm Jillian Berman. I'm a reporter and editor at MarketWatch, where I cover student debt. And just a little bit of background about how I got interested or sort of got involved in this topic. In 2015, MarketWatch wanted to hire a reporter to cover it. And so that was kind of how I came to it. I'm a millennial, if you can't tell, so obviously it was like in my milieu, but that was when I first started covering it seriously. And sort of shortly after that, maybe 2016, 2017, I came into contact with Fenaba and Jason. I think, honestly, through a PR pitch about one of their studies. I don't totally remember, but I've ever since found the research to be fascinating, and they've both been, oops, sorry. Uh-oh, sorry.
The microphone.
Technical difficulties. All right, hopefully that's better. Is that better? Better? No? No? Is it on? Oh, here we go. There we go. Now it's better. Yeah. Oop. Good? Okay. Great. Let me know if it, anyway. Yeah, they've both been a really great resource for my work, and I've followed it closely. So that kind of brings me to my first question for both of them, which is, how did you guys get interested in this topic of student debt, and in particular focusing on how it impacts Black borrowers?
Want me to go first? Or?
Sure.
Okay. So actually, I started studying student debt as a graduate student. I am also a millennial, I guess older millennial, I think that's the term as people tend to classify us. And I kind of felt like the conversations that I was having amongst friends and family, and especially after having finished undergraduate, were not coalescing with the theories that we were discussing and the ways that it was being discussed in the classroom, and in particular around the life course. So, how people invest in themselves and then it pays off afterwards, and it's really not an issue for long-term, short and long-term planning. So I really, I had been an RA on a project that was looking at actually relationship formation, so cohabitation and marriage. And that was my first foray into kind of looking at student debt, was understanding the relationship between student debt and relationship outcomes. And then the shorter story is that Jason and I both were in the same postdoc program, and that's where we met and discussed. I remember over dinner at my interview, potential collaborations, because we had, oh, you can go, I guess you can go into the conversation, but about how it had been difficult to actually convince both our dissertation committees that this was something worthy of study. But they trusted us. We finished. We finished our dissertations, but really thinking that there was something to this that needed to be examined and explored. Do you want to get into the?
Oh, I guess I would just kind of start by saying, yeah, I'm a geriatric millennial, is how I like to think of myself. And so I feel like actually probably all three of us sitting up here, I feel like we were probably on the leading edge of what we all agree now is a student loan crisis, which is quite something, because even 5 years ago, I don't think we all agreed that it was a student loan crisis. And I think, I was trained, as Sandy mentioned, primarily as a scholar of health disparities and mental health, but I also was always interested in stratification. And I just found myself sort of like Fenaba, a little bit, I don't know, unengaged or uninterested in a lot of the sociological work on higher education, particularly the work that was really framing college as sort of the primary engine of upward mobility. And it just struck me that, in my experiences being, a kid from rural Maine who went to a state school that was pretty cheap, all else equal, I was friends with a lot of people who had $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in debt, which according to, maybe some of our colleagues shouldn't have been possible, but of course it was. And so it just struck me that, I'm always a person that wants to research the social problems that seemed the most compelling of the day. And it struck me that sociologists weren't saying enough about student loan debt. And I felt like that was more interesting than trying to work in the capillaries of some problem we understood quite well, and also really important to me personally. I kind of started this focusing on, because of my training and probably because of my race, class, right? I was interested in first generation and low income college students. And it was in my dissertation where I started following the data and realizing, yeah, I'm seeing these pretty massive racial disparities that make all of the class differences I'm interested in look tiny in comparison. And that was really the conversation that Fenaba and I had, I think, in our first meeting, probably over a couple cocktails too. Probably. And that's where we really started our collaboration that I think we maybe thought would have been one paper, but turned into two. And then that second paper was so big that we decided to write a book around it. So, yeah.
And if you guys don't mind sharing, around what year was that conversation that you?
Well, we met in 2012. 2012.
Is that right?
Yeah. We met in 2012, and then.
So around 11 years ago?
Yeah. And then our first paper came out in 2016.
Got it. And you guys mentioned that it was hard to, at the time, sort of convince your dissertation advisors that it was, sort of worthy of study. What about it at the time? What was hard to convince them? Why were they skeptical?
First for me.
Yeah, you go for it.
I think there's an irony, given that I think we both started writing about student debt probably around 2008, 2009, sort of the height of the Great Recession. It was obvious to us. But I think a lot of the older colleagues we knew who were our mentors, some of them were sort of skeptical of this idea of, why are we so worried about student loan debt? I had one line that I will never forget is, basically, you shouldn't be worried about student loan debt because for the price of a new car, you get a lifetime of social and economic benefits. There's really no problem here at all. And that was a line that I think we got for a very, very long time. And we had it extended to be a hard time to publish a lot of this stuff for years and years and years. And now I kind of feel like this conversation has changed so much that it's actually a little bit jarring. Yeah.
People just couldn't believe that this altered decision-making, that debt was going to have an effect on people's, especially the populations who are seen as accumulating all this debt. So as we start out, I can speak directly to the book.
Yeah.
We start out, we talk about how the media covered student loan debt crisis. They tended to focus on people with six-figure debt. So, I had $400,000 of debt, and I went to school to study photography, and... I'm
a Starbucks barista.
Yeah, I'm a Starbucks barista now and can't pay it back, right? So these kinds of high figures that were shocking to hear, but if you dig into the data a little bit, you start to see that they represent a very small percentage of the overall student debt population. And the people that struggle the most are the people who have lower amounts of debt, so a couple $1,000s of debt, and actually have not completed their degree. And then speaking directly to the population that we're interested in, we find that for Black borrowers, it didn't matter if you finished your degree or not. It didn't matter what institutions you went to. It didn't matter if you were a woman or a man. It didn't matter, like, I don't know, but throw any observable characteristic, that people throw at you. What major, just throw all these things that people want to try to explain the disparities or the poor decision making as well. And we found that Black borrowers had, on average, just higher amounts of debt, and we're struggling with repayment.
Yeah, and you guys have both kind of, spoken about this in pieces already, but can you kind of describe to me, like, at the time that you were doing the research, or maybe when your research first published, what you would say, like, the prevailing narrative around student debt was?
Yeah, I kind of feel like there were maybe 3 or 4 prevailing narratives, and some narratives were sort of, I guess, louder or more accepted than others. I feel like I heard a lot or heard a little bit about there being a student loan debt accumulation crisis, right? Kind of going to the Starbucks barista with $400,000 in debt and a philosophy degree from NYU or something. And I think most folks looked at that data and they're just like Fenaba was saying, that just isn't super valid. These are outliers. I think other folks started to look at people at repayment, right? And so we looked at student loan default, and that is where you would see some pretty massive racial differences. But still, other people were basically saying, actually, what it is we have this completion crisis. So yes, the cost of college has gotten out of hand. Yes, we're saddling families and students with all this debt, but really the completion rate has been pretty flat for the last 20 years, and if we could somehow bump up the completion rate, this wouldn't be a big deal, because again, for the cost of a new car, you get a lifetime of social and economic benefits. And then there were plenty of folks, and I think my colleague Beth Akers was probably the loudest one. I don't know if this is still her position, is this idea that there's no crisis at all, that the median debtor has very little debt, very little trouble paying that debt off. And I think Beth was talking a lot about white borrowers in her analysis. I don't think intentionally, I just think that's who was driving her results. And I think that's probably true for white borrowers. And sort of our answer to all of this is like sort of this question of, is it an accumulation crisis? Is it a repayment crisis? Is it a completion crisis? Is there no crisis at all? The answer really depends on who you're looking at. And I think for Black borrowers, we see an accumulation crisis and a repayment crisis and a completion crisis all kind of coming together in a perfect storm. Whereas we just don't see that for borrowers of other racial groups, particularly white borrowers.
Yeah. I guess I would just add that a narrative that was also very persistent was the one that classified education debt as good debt. So if you study consumer finances or any kind of household finance, there's this usually the delineation between good and bad debt, right? So if education debt is considered an investment debt, like I said, you're investing in yourself, so you take on debt for a lot, but not all, as a young adult, and then you're essentially removing yourself from the labor market for a couple of years, but you're going to get a return on that investment over time that's going to make up more than the cost of that debt that you had. And so I would say the narrative shift over the last 10 years has been, and you'll see it in the media, is education debt still good debt? Is it good debt? And I've seen it pop up so many times. And I think that's probably where the shift has probably started, was people questioning, the classification of education debt as good debt, and then slowly, the revelation of who is struggling the most, and no longer focusing on those huge outliers with six-figure debt, but also Black borrowers and people who have gone to like for-profit institutions and just have accumulated so much debt and are struggling in the labor market. And so it starts to shift a little bit, and calling into question how we think about education debt and tying it to, I love that Drew's presentation started off with the great equalizer, because the idea of higher education being an engine of upward mobility, but for whom has it been associated with increased inequality or the inability to actually experience social mobility.
And I don't want to step on your future questions,
No,
but I feel like sort of the question, one thing that's really interesting about this is like sort of like what has changed about the narratives. And in some ways, you know, this book was 1 year COVID delayed, and the conversation around this has changed so much. It is quite shocking to me to see debt forgiveness be a central sort of platform of the Democratic Party compared to what I thought it would have been 5 years ago, which nowhere around there. But what's interesting, I think, is to ask what narratives haven't changed. And for me, a narrative I hear far too much, and I think we heard far too much from our borrowers, is this idea that if you find yourself in debt, it's somehow just, you just weren't responsible enough, or maybe you just didn't have the financial literacy to navigate the system. And you know, it's still something that politicians bandy about. It's something that a lot of conservative politicians have responded to Biden's debt forgiveness executive order with this. But I think for me, the most disheartening part of this is actually talking to borrowers, and it's the borrowers who have internalized this narrative themselves. They actually blame themselves for the choices they've made, even though they realize they were put in an impossible situation. And so that, for me, is the narrative that really needs to change. And I'm a bit pessimistic about how we change that, probably, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that comes up a lot in my reporting, too. And I think, you know, I'm always, when I talk to people for stories, I'm always cognizant of sort of what they've, the steps they've taken to avoid, you know, being in the situation that they're in, and nonetheless, you know, they find themselves there. And I guess, you know, why do you think that narrative is still so pervasive? Like, what's keeping it around?
Why? I mean, I guess people will just, it's built into how we view, I guess, how would I put this? It's built into how we view debt, I think, at a larger scale. I mean, we're focused on education, but it's seen as a personal choice. It's seen as a failing. We speak into the book about how even religion, kind of people, you know, within religious studies, people view it as a personal and moral failing sometimes to carry a lot of debt. So there's larger, you know, issues around, or a lot of theories around how people view debt, and I think it's easier to. And when we personalize, or when we make the issue one in which we say people made individual poor choices, then we can absolve ourselves from making policy-based solutions. And so I think that's why we also see a lot of you know, administrative or people with access to power clinging to these narratives, so that we don't have to seek a policy-based solution in order to address something that has structural roots, you know, it's easy to say, oh, you made a poor choice, therefore you have to live with this decision that you've made. Now, you know, it's fascinating also with regard to the Biden administration, you know, the Biden plan, to see how, when people started to attack it, then you saw the response. I don't know if anybody was on Twitter with regard to the PPP program. Yeah. I don't know if anyone followed that narrative that was going on. So people were saying, oh, well, there were a lot of people that applied for the PPP program and the Paycheck Protection Program, excuse me, and they got those debts forgiven. But now when you turn to individuals who took out money for their college loans, we have a problem with absolving it. So it's contextual, right? Yeah. Very much so. And, you know, there's a lot of differences there, but it's also, I think, reflective of how we view debt as being very situational and dependent on who the borrower is and the context in which it's been acquired.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, President Biden even, I think, briefly in a press conference also sort of made that, tried to make that point. Okay, let's dig in a little bit to the book itself. So can you guys talk to me about the process of, you know, of writing it and how you decided to go, you know, with qualitative and quantitative research? That, you know, it reminds me of journalism. That's kind of much less quantitative, but that's, you know, sort of our approach. So I'd love to hear how you decided to do that and how you put it all together.
Yeah, I mean, I think for both of us, and I don't want to speak necessarily for both of us, as academics and as demographers by training, we are sort of quantitative scholars, right? So we produced sort of these articles in which we were really interested in tackling or understanding racial disparities in student loan debt, and this data visualization is really we had this professionally done. This isn't anything we could do on our own, but this came out of sort of our first foray into this when we were really interested in racial disparities in debt accumulation. So by age 25. And like I said, we found that these disparities were quite massive. And for us, we were particularly interested because we're interested in student debt as sort of like this racialized sort of economic outcome, we're kind of really interested in thinking about its relationship to wealth, which is, of course, represents the sedimentation of racial inequality and is really the legacy that is one of the biggest legacies of slavery we have remaining is wealth disparities by race. And broadly, one of our early findings was like, look, this is in part a story about wealth. It's in part a story about underfunded institutions. And so, we did this work. We did more on the repayment side because we see, for example, that we see these massive racial disparities in student loan default across all institutions, right? So even among four-year college graduates, these are the folks who did quote unquote everything right. It's basically, I think, 1 in 4 black four-year college graduates will default on their loans within 12 years. Virtually no white borrowers do, right? So this isn't about people's decisions. And I think we were happy with our academic work, and we were happy trying to convince scholars that this work was important. But we got to a point where I think, especially in this the second paper we were working on, when we were just realized that there was a bigger audience, and it was in part through working with you and kind of getting this kind of word out there that there was a bigger audience out there, and also sort of as quantitative folks, I think we realized that we were missing sort of the meat on the bones, the narratives. We were not actually going out there and talking to people. And so, I think if we had our choice and if our feet were not held to the fire, we probably would have wrote a very quantitative book. And we tried to, and then our editor was like, no regression tables in this at all. Yeah. And so we went out and we talked to borrowers. And I mean, what we learned basically confirmed everything we thought we knew, and then we learned so much more, I think, in the process. So I think for us, it was a matter of, we were told basically, if you're going to write a book, you have to have narratives. You have to have journalistic narratives in some sense. You can't rely on numbers because they just won't convince everyone.
Yeah, and what were some of the things, when you did start, sort of interviewing people, what were some of the things that they said that surprised you?
Well, I'll start off by saying that we kind of used like a snowball sample. So we use social media to get people to to get respondents. Ooh, excuse me. The response was overwhelming. So one of the things I'll say is people would say, or if you study finance, people don't like to talk about their finances. People don't want to talk about money. That was not true at all. People, or I should say, for the people in the spaces that we reached out to, it was overwhelming. People were like, "Oh my God, yes, I want to talk to you. Oh my goodness, yes, I'm so glad someone wants to listen and hear what's going on. There's been no one to talk to about this," and the response was overwhelming. There was also highly gendered. So our sample is overwhelmingly Black women. And as a Black woman, that's not surprising to me, but it's just heartbreaking to hear that this is the population that is struggling, quite a bit with this, and are ready to tell. And I think it's tied into no one's listening to me, no one's hearing my stories, no one is listening. Has asked me about this student debt issue that has been plaguing my lives and my family. So what we do in the book, and kind of as we've described already, we go through the accumulation phase, and then we go in. So it's divided into 2 parts. Here we go.
There.
You'll get there. The accumulation phase, and then the repayment phase. And we speak a lot in the accumulation phase about familial networks and kin networks, and how how borrowers and their parents have made the decision that they wanted to go to college. That so the decision is, you got in, but how are we going to make this happen, right? And so the different approaches that we have multiple terms we used while we were writing. One was like all hands on deck, which was how family members stepped up and in surprising and sometimes unfortunate ways to help their children, their nieces and nephews go to school. So putting tuition on credit cards, for example, heavily betting on scholarships to come through. And then also navigating the high school networks. So going to picking particular schools because they didn't have, the wealth or the money, but knowing that that school was tracking towards certain institutions as well. I know. Do you want to speak to the repayment side as far as or?
Well, actually, kind of, if we're going with the question of like what was surprising, I mean, it just goes back to whenever anyone talked about our work, oftentimes it really came back to these questions of financial literacy, which is usually not what Fenaba and I wanted to talk about. That's certainly not what I wanted to talk about. But one thing that didn't necessarily surprise me, but really stood out, was just how financially literate everyone we talked to was. I mean, these are folks who had spreadsheets. When they got to the repayment side, they had spreadsheets to make sure they could hit their, whatever, $200 a month they had to make their payments, and they were juggling with all these other bills. Maybe they were sending money back home, sending money because their mom or their parents were sick. And basically, they were one financial disaster away from this whole house of cards falling down. And I mean, the first thing you learn about folks who are sort of living in that situation is they're way better at budgeting than most of us sitting in this room are. I can tell you that much. I mean, that's what scarcity does. And so I was really struck by the fact of just how financially literate everyone was, and we call this, this idea of everyone had these best laid plans. Like they had thought through everything from the application side and where they were going to go to college and why, and how much they were going to get an aid every year and how that would pan out. It just didn't work out that way for most people. But what was also, I think, surprising is just as everyone was as financially literate as you could imagine by the definition of how we usually measure that in the social sciences, people also pointed to themselves and said, well, I wish I took more financial literacy courses, or I wish I did this differently, or I wish I did that differently. And it sort of goes back to that internalization of personal responsibility. I mean, I talked to one woman who basically said, in high school, I looked for scholarships. I tried to go to the cheapest schools, but I really wish I would have known. Maybe I could have opened my own business, or I could have done all these other sorts of things, which were just ludicrous for a 17-year-old to have had the capability of doing. But that was the standard she was holding to herself, because saying, maybe if I had done this differently, I wouldn't be where I'd ended up. So just sort of this two-step, this dance you see between someone who is clearly responsible and financially savvy, but they just don't view themselves as such. And that was my big surprise out of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to let everyone know we will be having time for questions, so if you start thinking about those, if you have any. And I'd love to go back to that idea of best laid plans. I'm going to read a passage from the beginning of the book that stuck out to me a lot, sort of about this, where you guys write, nearly everyone we talked to felt they had no choice but to borrow to fund their college education. All of them went to college with best laid plans, a clear plan for their course of study and how they would fund their college degree, but this was not enough to protect them from taking on excessive debts. And I think, what's interesting about that for me and what you guys are talking about is, in my work when I interview people, I hear something similar a lot of the times, but in the, media or social media conversation around student debt, that's not always what you hear. And I'd love to just, dig into that a little more and talk about, why are best laid plans not enough, especially, for borrowers in general, but particularly for Black borrowers, as you guys go into in the book.
Well, I'll just say, as a scholar who studies wealth, we think of wealth as being an insurance mechanism. So if you have this private social safety net, if your household experiences a shock, such as unemployment or a health shock, if someone comes down with a chronic condition, or an accident, you can draw upon this pool of money to help buffer or to help you weather the hard times. If you don't have that and something happens, as you cannot predict, it's unpredictable, then are very few public mechanisms to help households and families and households out. And so because of racial wealth inequality, the median Black household has just less access, less funds to draw upon during those times. So like, as I was describing before about the role of familial networks being very important, and we know from work that actually has been produced by the Cook Center, Black families overwhelmingly support their children. They just don't have the same, they can't provide the same amount of support to their families. So we also know that, white students also borrow for college, but there's also, studies that show that that their families also assist them with paying down those debts, whereas that's unfortunately, a little less common, or the amount of money that is assisting to help is more likely to flow in the other direction. So once you've made it to college, this comes across in the book as well. Some of our respondents replied, oh no, I can't turn to my family. I have to do this alone because they've helped me. Either they've helped me out so much, or there's just really they don't have much to give.
And I think just to follow up on what Fenaba mentioned, I think a lot of that action in the book kind of happens as you move from chapter 2 to chapter 3. Yeah. I think a lot of folks have some really clear best laid plans as they get accepted into college, and that first year, maybe their parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles are doing all these sorts of stuff. Parents are taking out obscene amounts of plus loans where there's no limits. If we're talking about a student loan crisis among Black borrowers, we should talk about the student loan crisis among Black parents too. But really, everything's really fine in that first moment. Parents are there, aunts and uncles, other family members are kind of helping them kind of get to where they need to be, but they've tapped out those resources. And so by the second year, sort of the precarity and despair that Fenaba was talking about sort of just comes to college. It's like, we're talking to a lot of people who are kind of, again, geriatric millennials like ourselves. They were kind of going into college during the Great Recession too, or maybe they're in their 30s right now. And so, their parents lost their jobs, they lost the house, or like Fenaba was saying, mom got sick or their aunt got sick, and now all of a sudden, not only can they not get help from home, but they're sending money home. And it's not, we think about in financial aid the expected family contribution being the amount that families are expected to give to students, when in reality, for a lot of these students, when they're at school, there's an expected family contribution that they need to be able to help out back at home. And so a lot of those plans really kind of unfolded and unfurled in years 2, 3, and 4, and sometimes 5, because as they're sort of taking on more jobs, as they're sending more money back home and they're borrowing more, sort of academics take a back seat. And then you're enrolled in year 5 or year 6, and then you're borrowing more to sort of keep up with that as well. So it's really kind of, I would say chapter 3 is where all of those best laid plans sort of come undone.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I'd love to just I have a few questions that are sort of running through different steps that we see up here and that you guys talk about in the book, and how, sort of how we see this play out, I guess, over the life course of a student and borrower. So maybe we can start even actually going to college or getting involved in the college process. One thing that you guys bring up is the idea of the education gospel, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what role that plays in pushing Black students towards college, and also how it interacts with sort of the economic reality of labor market discrimination, and just how that all comes to play in pushing the students that you talk to towards college.
Yeah, you said a lot of it in your question. Yeah. So this idea about thinking about the education gospel, how the trajectory or going towards or pursuing a higher education is going to be the ticket, right? The ticket out of or movement into the middle class. And I should say that there's a lot of great empirical work that kind of shows college being a strong predictor of financial security, or however you want to measure economic outcomes. And so I want to, and I think we emphasize in the book as well, it's a rational choice that these people are pursuing this trajectory, right?
Definitely.
So we don't believe that, or we don't. I can speak for both of us. That people are making irrational choices, and we think about it in the context of inequality and stratification. we know that there is discrimination in the labor market. We know, that there's still, white people with a criminal record are, more likely to receive callbacks and get hired, relative to a Black person with a college degree. So, these things still exist. So, not only are you trying to, are you making rational decisions in so far as going to college, but the fact that you don't have the money and taking on this debt to do so is a large financial risk that you hope will pay off. So yeah, I just want to kind of underscore that we definitely don't.
Right. Yeah.
Believe that our respondents and people who are currently in this predicament have done so because they've made irrational choices. But what we do see is that, and I think Drew actually set this up as well, thinking about how this credentialing of within our society. So not only is it that you need a college degree, but now we see more and more people returning because you need the graduate degrees, you need the certificates in order to get the job or to get the promotion in your job, right? And all of that requires time, but also taking on more debt to do so. So we have this strong belief in this connection between mobility and credentialing that is tied to advanced education within our society, and how that plays out for, in particular, populations that have been shut out, have been exploited, have been, it means that in a world in which we have a debt-financed higher education system and you don't have any wealth or any funds to do so, you're going to have to go into debt in order to get those credentials.
And so then taking it to, sort of the next step, okay, you've realized that you have to go to college and now you're applying and you're going through the financial aid paperwork. You guys talked, you talked a little bit already about the expected family contribution and how that, plays out differently by race. But I'm wondering if you can talk, some of the things that I found really interesting in the book were, sort of some of the hidden parts of the financial aid application or financial aid system that really sort of disproportionately harm Black borrowers. And so I'm wondering if you guys can just talk about a few of those.
Yeah, I'll talk about a little bit. I mean, so I think it's Sue Dynarski who calls the financial aid system in the U.S. Byzantine, and I don't think that's wrong. It's complicated, right? A lot of the people we talked to, their parents weren't filling out the FAFSAs, they were filling them out for them. But I think when you think about race, how this ends up really mattering is you fill out these financial aid forms, you're trying to get your parents' income, you're trying to get some sense of their ability to pay, and the whole goal is to calculate, again, this expected family contribution. And the problem is that number just totally ignores sort of the racial wealth gap, which ends up being really important. So for example, on a financial aid form, you're filling out your family's income. You can fill out assets, but it's certainly not required and they're not verified. And so for a lot of middle class, say your parents make $70,000, $80,000 a year, for a lot of white kids, they might see an expected family contribution that looks in line, and if they need a little bit more, maybe the parents take out a home equity loan. Maybe they have some savings stashed away from an inheritance. In other words, you take a sort of a middle income white family and you treat a middle income Black family in the same way on these forms in terms of, okay, they have the same income, they have the same ability to pay, and it's simply not true, right? These families aren't able to draw from home equity as easily, don't necessarily have the savings or inheritances. And so already baked into our financial aid forms, you have this sort of bias really sort of baked in that assumes that Black families are actually able to pay a lot more than white families in that sense because we're not holding wealth constant.
Yeah. And then, okay, so you filled out the forms, and now you get to college. One thing that you guys also talk a lot about is sort of, the kinds of schools where white borrowers are disproportionately represented and the types of schools where Black borrowers are disproportionately represented and sort of what that means for their trajectory. And I'm wondering if you can, kind of dig into that and how that impacts the amount of debt they have and their ability to repay.
Sure. So we see differences, and there's studies that have shown that students that attend, so minority serving institutions, so MSIs, such as historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, or tribal colleges and universities, or Hispanic serving institutions and universities, they tend to have larger or average debt burdens than attending a PWI, so predominantly white institution. These schools also have significantly lower endowments, and they are not able to offer as generous financial aid packages to their students. They're also not able to offer kind of, like, I guess, more creative or innovative kinds of tuition programs that we've seen kind of are on the rise. So like promise programs, for example, and that are not merit-based, but are a little bit more generous to kind of help their student population or low-income populations. We also know that for like the Pell Grant, so it was mentioned before in Andrew's presentation, did not keep up with inflation over time. So whereas that is supposed to be a grant that is supposed to assist low-income students, you know, we still see those students taking on student debt. I don't know, like the irony that we had this debt Biden plan that was like, oh, you know, $10,000 for anyone, you know, to have their debt absolved, and then an even higher amount for people who had Pell Grant. Yes, that's great and generous, but why do we live in a world that a Pell Grant recipient, you know, should have such much debt that they have to absolve, you know? So that's kind of the, you know, the things that we sit back and think about, you know, and you know, question, worry, and you know, say, or is reflective of a system that is just not doing what it needs to, what it should have been doing, or what it needs to have been doing.
Yeah, and I would add to that too that they, as part of the program too, parents who had a Pell Grant, right, they also get the $20,000, which is like, you know, theoretically, if you were a parent who had a, I guess if the Pell Grant worked sort of as it was supposed to, hopefully you wouldn't have had to borrow for your own kids. So yeah. Anyway, yeah.
There's just a lot of you know, things that have come to light, I think, in both in this becoming such a you know, front page issue that speaks a lot to how we view, I think, higher education. And how we viewed what higher education has become as it's grown and become, I would say, increasingly racially and socioeconomically diverse.
Yeah, and then I'd add to that, you know, higher education has become more racially and socioeconomically diverse over time, but that, as my colleague Laura Hamilton sometimes says, that diversity has come without funding.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know, sure, the Duke universities of the world and the Dartmouths of the world and the Harvards of the world have an endowment so they can offer these generous packages to say, if your parents make less than 60 or 100K, sure, you don't pay much or anything to go here. But in the reality is that a lot of state-funded or public institution where most people go, we've seen nothing but budget cuts for the last 25, 30 years. And when those cuts happen, for example, in North Carolina, they don't happen to UNC Chapel Hill. They don't happen to the flagships. They happen to the institutions that are more regional, that are branch campuses. I'm not up with my UNC branch campus sort of lingo, so I don't want to name drop the wrong school here. But that's where those cuts are going, and that's the schools that serve kind of the highest proportion students of color and low-income students as well. So we're starving the institutions that are actually should be there to help those who have the least, the most, but they're not.
Yeah, and then and so now you've graduated, perhaps from an institution that was underfunded, and it's time to repay your debt. And I think one thing that you guys talk a lot about are sort of some of the challenges that people face on income-based repayment or income-driven repayment. And you know, you have there's a borrower in there, I think her name is Danielle, who you talk about. You know, she ended up defaulting on her loans while she was waiting for the income-driven repayment paperwork to come through. You know, can you theoretically, right? Income-driven repayment should be protecting people from those kinds of consequences. But why did you guys find it? You know, it isn't really working well.
Yeah. So again, this is pre-Biden plan,
right?
So
yes.
And pre-COVID. So we ended our interviews in 2019. So prior to the pandemic, although we do have a COVID afterward, a COVID pandemic afterward, where we went back and interviewed some of our respondents. I'm just saying that to say that when answer directly your question, we highlighted a lot of you know, administrative burden, which is a public administration term that is inherent in the repayment process. A lot of it is opt-in,
Right.
So people have to apply for IDRs. So you have to kind of provide a lot of paperwork showing your income. So if you've been unemployed or inconsistently employed, it's a massive time and time burden for people to kind of produce these. It can be a burden to produce this kind of information. So throughout the system, and we kind of talk about it, we track it in chapter 4, chapter 4 or 5, how people would be on the phone with servicers and, having, some of them were helpful and some of them were not so helpful, having to produce what they need. Or we even talk a little bit about PSLF, so public service loan forgiveness, like trying to track and know what loans qualified you, and actually it's tied to employer. So what employer you worked with that would recognize and be recognized under the program. So just all these kinds of pieces or parts of the process that if it wasn't exactly correct could mean that you weren't going to get weren't going to be enrolled or weren't going to consistently be enrolled, and that you had to reapply and submit this stuff every year. So how can we create systems and implement policies in a way that that they don't increase inequalities, right? Is essentially what we're asking. We're showing that the system was actually increasing inequalities, but we are asking, like, what can we do about it? And I said that this happened pre-COVID because a lot of these issues have been addressed in the Biden plan, as far as it being, several of these administrative burdens have been addressed in the currently proposed Biden plan.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing that President Biden did propose was sort of reforming IDR so that, or income-driven repayment, so that it's more generous. And I'm wondering, but it doesn't. There's still potentially a paperwork issue, and so I'm wondering, sort of how far a more generous plan goes to sort of alleviating some of the issues that the borrowers you spoke with brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes pretty far. It doesn't fix the administrative burden problem necessarily, but it does fix another problem. So going back to Danielle, who in the book, we basically, she's a single woman. She lives in a major metro area where the costs of living are quite high. And the way disposable income is calculated in income-driven repayment really kind of assumes you have fewer expenses than you probably do. And so what it meant for her, paying 10% of her income, I think ended up being around a shade over 200, if memory serves. And essentially she could do that. And she could do that if nothing else went wrong. If she didn't have to send back money back home, if she didn't have some emergency. And so kind of as we were going with before, she was always sort of one unexpected expense away. We often talk about how people don't have these $400 cushions we need for emergency savings. She was one unexpected expense away from not being able to afford this at all. So she was on the repayee plan, so I think she was paying 10% of disposable income. So with the Biden plan, that gets her down to 5%. I think is that right?
If she only has undergrad loans.
If she only has undergrad loans, which no one does. So getting this down to 5%, I think is a good move. I think changes in how the National Consumer Law Center actually has what's called the Affordable Budget Conscious, or ABC plan, where they're basically arguing we need to do what we do with the supplemental poverty rate, essentially, and adjust for cost of living across different places, and max this out at, I think they say 8% is what they're looking for. So I think this gets us closer to that. But what this doesn't do is this doesn't reduce the administrative burden. I mean, I actually when I looked at the Biden plan, I was like, wow, nobody's talking about the IBR changes, and these are massive. It would have been much better had they made IBR opt-out instead of opt-in. They're never going to do that because it would be expensive. But that is really what I think every economist I know working in higher education basically says this is the simplest fix, right? If there's these administrative barriers, we should just have people automatically enrolled in income-based repayment. If you want to go into the standard plan or just pay more, pay more. And I think what our government has kind of proven in the COVID-19 pandemic is we can actually distribute money without being so administratively burdensome, whether it's the checks that everyone was receiving, or I don't know if anyone actually participated in loan forgiveness of the Biden plan, whether it goes through with the courts, we'll see. But it was a pretty easy website to go to. You just went in, you punched in a few information, you were done. Everything should be that easy, and it isn't. And hopefully we'll see more changes to public service loan forgiveness, which is already seeing these overhauls. But he sort of got halfway there with those changes, I think.
Yeah. Some people that I have spoken to about the IDR plan say that at least it's maybe trying to provide an option that is clearly the best option for most people, and so some of the I mean, obviously the paperwork's still involved, but some of the complexity is around like thinking through what should I do, and kind of gums people up. Okay, we're getting close to question time, so just a quick, I guess, like lightning round on a couple Biden administration proposed solutions and how far they go to address some of the issues that you guys discussed. So let's just start with the big one, the broad-based student debt forgiveness. How far does that go in getting at some of the issues you guys discuss?
I mean, anyone that's seen me interviewed before, I say I wanted it all canceled. So I'm not going to say it didn't go far enough. We need. I was for full debt cancellation, and because of my the work that I've done and the focus on Black borrowers who have disproportionately higher burdens, it will help. But they will still have. There's still a large number of them that have. Will still have some debt. It's not going to erase those. It's going to erase a lot of debt for that significant number of people who are. Have several thousands of dollars in debt, but we also know that there is quite a few of them who are have $40,000, $50,000. So I am a champion of full debt cancellation, and then also reforms in higher education as well. So that's not the only solution that we need. We need to overhaul higher education financing.
I would add, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a pessimist, but I'm going to try to take my half-glass full view of this and say that, this was a win, I think, and we should applaud everyone who did all of the work to make this happen. And there's a lot of people who've been working on the ground for a long time who made this happen. So I think it's a huge win. I also think that this isn't enough and that it's broadly a downstream solution to an upstream problem, hence Chapter 7, and that if we don't have more sort of inclusive higher education reform, we're only going to, if this actually is allowed to go through by the courts, we're going to find ourselves back here in 5 to 10 to 15 years. And so we need to find a solution. My colleague Charlie Eaton says, no, we're just going to be like the Middle Ages and we'll just have a debt jubilee every 10 years. I'm not that optimistic, but it's a win and we need more.
All right, I think, so that's a good time to open it up for questions. Yeah, okay, in the front. Yeah.
Hi, great dialogue, and I appreciate you taking time to write this book. I would like to drill down on the distinction between the experiences of students at HBCUs, and they're requiring higher debt loads than those going to PWI. So I got my undergrad at Central, and I got my master's at UNC. And I'm wondering, of those individuals that had a similar experience, what did you find was the most contributing factor to how they ended up with so much debt? Was it their experience at the HBCU, the culture, the dynamics around what information they received or what they understood to be true about what they were doing, or was it some other pieces, if that makes sense?
I would say that it was the amount of financial aid that they received, so they are, it wasn't, some people who went to PWIs were more likely to have started off with some scholarships, and then either the second year the scholarship didn't come through, and so they had to take on some debt, right? But arriving at the institution and and realizing that you need a little bit more, right? Or you need to take an extra class, and then you don't have enough to cover the overall tuition, and then the solution being take on a loan. I should say, we haven't mentioned it yet, but also turning to the private loan market to kind of
Gets ugly fast.
to help pay tuition was also pretty common amongst, I mean, and again, not just students that attend HBCUs, but more talked about juggling the multiple loan streams, the public, the private, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I think the other big kind of theme that comes out of the book is that students are doing better and accumulating less debt at places that support them financially and socially. And there's a lot of schools that have been, as we talk about, doing more with less, right? And I think HBCUs kind of fall into that camp. You know, there's plenty of schools that might not have the biggest endowments, but they have these programs, and they have, you know, maybe they have micro grants, maybe they have a strong mentoring system that are helping students. I mean, we certainly, there's a section of chapter 3 in the book that's called Rich College, Poor College, Predatory College, right? And this is where we sort of, I think, will provide the more sort of the better answer to your question. But I think that what we've found in our own research, especially in the quantitative research, is, you know, a lot of what the higher debt levels for students who are attending MSIs has to do with is the fact that these institutions are underfunded. And this is linked to like what legacies of state legislatures are doing. It's also linked to having a sort of an alumni base that is less wealthy. That is also sort of linked to sort of the legacy of slavery. But we actually don't find any evidence that net of those funding shortfalls. So if we're comparing an HBCU to a similarly funded like public branch campus, people kind of have similar debt outcomes, right? So I don't think we would say that HBCUs are doing sort of worse than other schools. In fact, I would say they're doing more with less.
All right. Yes. Well, you in the third row, and then you in the fourth. Yeah.
So Keith, yes.
So one, I've got a ton of questions, but I'll stick to one. So the data that you shared with the discrepancy between Hispanic households and Black borrowers, Hispanic borrowers, and Black borrowers, when you think about the general racial wealth gap, there's usually not that much divergence between those relationships. So I'm curious as to what you think might be the causal factors for that gap. Because usually when you see like racial wealth gap data, Hispanics and African Americans kind of neck and neck, depending on what data set you look at, but it's usually not that large of a discrepancy. So I'm curious to know
Yeah.
Hispanic and Black.
Do you want to try to
No.
answer? Jason's like, I'll say, I'm looking at when the data was collected. We were actually part of a Borrowers of Color working group, and we have some colleagues that did some work on like Latinx loan, and they actually found that that they're the fastest growing group with student loan debt, and a lot of it has happened post-Great Recession. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at these numbers and thinking, I don't know if we have more updated data, it might be that they're closer to Black borrowers now, because that's actually the fastest growing group with student loan debt. You know, we studied Black borrowers for a number of reasons, as we've highlighted this evening, but also because they're like the most extreme. And so, you know, I would say that usually the data tends to find that Hispanic or Latinx people, wealth tends to fall in between, right? It's just, are they, depending on how you slice and dice it, is it closer to the Black borrowers or a little bit closer to, you know, the white borrowers? And that could vary from anything from like geographic location to age to household structure and so on and so forth. So it depends, just to answer your question. But also maybe just a lag in the data too. Okay. Oh, yeah, you first.
I have a couple related questions. I mean, the first was about HBCUs. So I was thinking about a colleague of ours who was at Spelman, who we saw early part of 2010. This was right when the recession was, I think it took a while for people to realize how bad the recession was and how long it was going to be. And I remember her telling us that they didn't realize what was happening until they got back to campus, and something like 30% of the students didn't come back. And they thought, oh gosh, what's happening? Are they sick? You know, did they have some kind of accident? And they literally had all of the faculty stop what they were doing and get on the phone and call these kids' parents and say, what's going on? And it was a variety of, one of the parents lost their job, or some relative lost their job, and they had to send them help. And so the school was in a scramble. We just not even apples and oranges. It's not even close. And so I don't know if you are thinking about any sort of plans to find a way. Because who's endowing the schools? It's the alumni. Guys. And if your alumni don't have, I mean, to some extent, I mean, UT Austin is a whole other story. They've got Houle. But if you don't have the money, you can't give it to your school. But the other thing I was thinking about too was this whole notion of, if you could speak a little bit to the role that the credit supporting system has and sort of this sort of tyranny of the credit rating and how that's affecting students. I mean, I can remember 5-7 years ago talking to a lot of young people in schools in their early 30s who were taking on all this debt. And I came from a family where that was just like, no, you just don't do it. A huge influence in my family of people who had survived the Depression. But friends of ours who were financiers and financial managers were saying, management people, debt's not that big a deal right now. And these young people are not going to be penalized for carrying the debt. In fact, some people think they're really smart for taking on debt. And so I'm sort of curious to know, what your thoughts were about that. It's like 5-7 years ago. They were buying houses, they were buying automobiles, and I just thought, well, that's fascinating that even Black people are not being looked at disparagingly for taking on debt. So was that actually just a mirage that actually had never really happened, or?
There's two questions.
There's two questions, right? I will say, I'll just quickly to the first, and maybe Jason can add more. When we think about endowments, it's also important to know that usually money that's towards an endowment, stuff is earmarked. So they can't necessarily touch a lot of that money, and people that have larger endowments have, money that may be earmarked for financial aid, but it's a little bit larger pool to pull from, right? But it's a yeah. So schools kind of are constrained in how they can use their endowments.
You can maneuver a lot more if you have 33.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
I'll just add also on the endowments. It's kind of interesting, in historically, it's been like and it's not just a wealthy alumni base that sort of helps to build the endowment. There was some like prestige associated with donating to, prestigious elite colleges, and only now are people starting to realize, my money might go a little bit further. Wealthy donors who have no ties to these schools, basically, my money could go a little bit further if I gave it elsewhere. But it's still like very few and far between, I would say.
And then I think one of the sort of natural experiments that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, for lack of a better term, was, I'm going to totally butcher this, but it's in the appendix and it's right there, is one of the first sort of relief acts that Biden did when he became president was some reinvestment act, I don't remember which. American Rescue Plan. But he ended up giving money to a lot of colleges and universities, and particularly made sure that funds were earmarked for HBCUs and MSIs. And what you basically found is when these schools had these sort of unrestricted funds they could use, they used it to help students. So was it Florida?
It was Tennessee, was it?
Yeah, there was Tennessee. There was also an HBCU in Florida that basically used all of that money to pay all of the institutional debts that their students had, right? They couldn't forgive federal student loans or anything like that, but a lot of them had substantial debts from the institution itself, which kind of just shows that once these schools that have these very small endowments, once they had some money to work with, they could actually do something to sort of help students in that way, yeah.
The second part was about credit score.
Credit rating systems, yeah. That's the wealth chapter.
Yes, yeah. So how I'll say that when I tend to speak on this, I talk about both the short and long-term consequences of student loan debt, and defaulting, being delinquent, negatively impacts your credit. So I will say a little bit more anecdotally when I talk to. I've talked to servicers or people who are talking about like millennials who have come in and want to get a mortgage, right? And they have all this student loan debt, how that negatively impacts the ability to get a competitive interest rate, or even, to get some signatures in order to get a mortgage loan. So I think, I'm not sure when the graph started to shift on that, but it is something serious and something that has been negatively impacting people's ability to make long-term, acquire long-term assets. I'll also say that, if for those of us who study the racial wealth gap, we tend to focus on the asset side of the balance sheet. So usually that's where we see the largest, differences in home ownership, in businesses, capital and all those things. And historically, when we tend to look at the debt side, there was no significant difference in debt by race. But that started to change, and the one outlier was education loan debt. So if you look at historically, as education loan debt started to increase over the last 30, 40 years, and we start to see education debt pull away, we also started to see these massive racial debt disparities in the student, when we discuss wealth inequality within our society. And I should say what's driving a lot of why there was usually no difference on the debt side of the balance sheet was because of credit market discrimination largely. Like, it was so hard to even just get access to credit, right? So here we see, and we can start talking about like predatory debt or predatory inclusion of how getting access to these types of products has come at a very high financial risk.
Yeah, and I think the credit rating system, I think you're absolutely right. Like it's if you have these student loan debts, particularly for defaulting, or if you just have too much debt on your balance sheet, you might not get the mortgage at the rate you wanted to get it to. You might not get the car refinance. We certainly talk to people like that. But I think the other end of this, where we see this going on, and they're actually being investigated for this right now, is there's a lot of private loan servicers who are looking at the demographics of their potential borrowers and saying, we're going to actually charge you a 15% interest rate on this student loan rather than a 10% rate because you are quote unquote high risk. And so you see this going on in the private loan market too, and the CFPB has investigated some of these companies, and so far nothing, but I think you also see it on that end too. Even though the private loan market is small, it affects a lot of Black borrowers.
Yeah, and I think if we're talking about the same thing, what's interesting about that is they're trying, the lenders are saying that we're using different data than what the traditional credit scoring system uses, and by pulling this alternate, they call it alternative data, by pulling this alternative data, like the outcomes should be better by race, or should be less discriminatory, I guess. But what's sort of actually happening is the way that they're pulling the data, often the sort of decision is similar. So, yes. Last question. Okay.
So I want to qualify my question by saying that I am a Black woman who has made a choice to do qualitative research where I center the voices and wisdom of Black women. So when I hear what you all have done and am familiar with Dr. Fenaba's journey specifically, I see a case where you all have curated more reasons to follow Black women, learn from Black women, and listen to Black women. So, Jason, I'm very curious, as a white scholar who's working with a brilliant Black woman, and as a white scholar who is learning from other brilliant Black women in your work, I'm curious about your unlearning journey, some of your racial realities, how they have shifted, anything that you can speak on to make it a bit more personal, right? Because it's really easy for us to remove ourselves from the work. So I'm asking for what kind of connection, what kind of awakening, what kind of enlightenment personally have you come into as a white scholar, following, learning, and listening to Black women?
Well, you had to end on a question like this. I mean, it's a great question. And I think about that a lot because I grew up in rural Maine, in one of the whitest states in the country. I went to one of the whitest sort of undergraduate institutions in the country. And I think for me, I approach studying race as sort of like, okay, this isn't sort of my world. This isn't something I should be able to study. And I think when I started getting into the student loan debt world, I realized just how important race was. And so for me, it was a matter of seeking out the folks who seemed to understand the experience, and if we want to be good critical race theorists and know that people of color have the best understanding of the oppression that happens in this system, and while someone like me, it's always second or third or fourth hand, right? I think that's why I gravitate towards working with Fenaba, for example. It's like I'm learning a lot from her. I learn a lot from Tressie Cottom's work. I'm inspired by the woman who wrote our foreword, Ayanna Pressley, right? Who is actually one of the politicians who's actually fighting to make real change in this regard. And so, I'm trying to find a way to, I don't really know how to answer this question other than rambling, which maybe is an answer in and of itself. But I think for me, it has been quite a journey from being a super white kid in a super white place to now someone who's still in a very white state, in a very white institution. But, for me, I think it's important to call attention to this, to listen to Black women, to cite Black women, as you said. And I think I'll be honest with you, it is uncomfortable for me to be up here and be a spokesperson, and something Fenaba and I talk about a lot. She usually rolls her eyes at me and tells me it's not something I need to worry about, but I think a lot about it. I actually talked to Jillian about this not too far into the pandemic, that sort of when it is appropriate for me to speak up and when it is not. I think I've become really good at convincing white people this is a problem, and I think that's my strong suit. And I'm always trying to check my privilege, I think, in that regard. But I deeply appreciate that question, and it's hard for me to answer it without sounding like an idiot.
Great last question. And thanks, everyone.
So I've been tasked with giving closing remarks, which is unenviable because, of course, the food awaits the next room over. So let me just say thank you all for joining us. It's been a tremendous semester. This book is a tremendous achievement. We're delighted to continue the conversation with you in the room next door over a meal. And in the meantime, please join me in thanking Jillian Berman, Jason Houle, and Fenaba.